It sounds as if the stories of vampires are true or at least have a true core.
Yes, there is something true behind every myth, even if the vampire myth from southeastern Europe is derived quite differently and only hit this notch rather accidentally, but still described it aptly. Well, because the digital nobility of the worldly and religious ruling elites, houses and institutions are only allowed to live on Earth. They sometimes perform their sucking of Quanta in a very earthly way, in an almost trivial murderous way. Sometimes at least. In any case, there is sometimes something like a kind of family gathering or meeting, quite banal actually, where these digital people, usually also by attending inaugurated analog blood relatives, activate technical routines of the stalking club in order to let the Quanta of a very pure victim on Earth, who still has all his Quanta, be completely transferred to themselves. The more pure a victim is, the more Quanta they can suck off without the victim dissolving completely. That is a condition that has to be met. Nevertheless, the victim dies in the process. For them, it is like when a family gets together and then enjoys a festive feast. The digital nobility does not need any fat or carbohydrates, but has an appetite for Quanta due to its decaying consciousness structure. None of this is to be confused with the gatherings of elites or analogous blood relatives of the nobility or other controlled power-hungry puppets, who exactly imitate this ritual of the digital nobility out of reverence and then also make a disgustingly bloody sacrifice. These are just rituals and behaviors that express devotion and enthusiasm for the digital nobility. No Quanta are transferred, i.e. sucked off.
And the aliens of the club, how does it work for them with the suction, technically? Do they have to work on or dock on a person in some special way to suck him or her dry?
Yes, they only suck off mentally, but the digital nobility rulers down here have to organize this for them, by making the cooperation and the mental and emotional states of people absolutely enslaving, ruthless and unjust. The nobility do this by means of extensive social, economic, technical, religious and political influences. In this way, free will is loosened in man, the heart loses to the ego, which makes it easier for people to lose their quantum of consciousness. In this way it is truly easier to rob them of their soul, which generally leads to a quantum deficiency among people, which in turn leads to a struggle of quantum-robbed people against unrobbed people. This struggle and deficiency leads to further emaciation and eventually traps people in a selfishly instinctive reaction mechanism, in which one can then permanently take Quanta from them.
So a negative worldly stage is created, on which the mental sucking off of Quanta is then made possible for the club?
Yes, but that alone is not always enough. For about half of the people, a hidden physical installation is needed to help the species in the club suck it out. For this purpose, there are short hypnotic anesthetics for people, so that through these implantations on Earth they can then be better put into a mental state, through which the individual quantum consciousness of a human being can be loosened more easily. This is necessary for half of all people, because their free will is too strong to be able to crack it mentally on their own. These people then have something inside themselves, so that they are more inclined on Earth to engage in mean, aggressive and selfish behavior, in order to be brought to the release of their quantum consciousness, the giving up of their free will, their intuition. In this way people have less and less real freedom, act affected, egoistic, impulsive, greedy, unattractive, inconsiderate, have many fears and little real power of decision, but usually do not notice it. Most of them do not even know why they act in this way, but then they usually only think about it a little and have less pangs of conscience. Many also build up an intellectual, double moral defensive thinking, with which they can justify their cold actions for themselves and towards other people.
That is incredible. Terrifying.
Yes, most of it is completely automated, because you can't easily handle the amount of people. That's why there are automatic routines and artificial beings. They do all that. They go through walls.
Are some people visited more often?
Some people are visited more often, yes, for readjustment. Or because they have a special position in a large company or concern, and have to parry accordingly. But mostly it is for readjustment. Because you can't do something like that from a distance, you have to visit them again.
Can you tell that you have been visited?
Yes, actually, but no one would ever know how to classify it. For example, readjusted people have not only had something planted in their limbs, but also something planted in their heads, so that they finally function halfway. Some people might notice this treatment on themselves if they paid attention to the after effects of the operation. For example, when you comb your hair in the morning, that is, when you put some pressure on the sutures of your skull plates with the comb, there is a pulling pain. Then there might be something behind it, depending on how much the sutures of the cranial plates were irritated and how the sutures suffered from the procedure. These after effects can occur. These are minimally invasive operations, which are only carried out on and in the sutures of the skull plates.
That is absolute madness. And all this because they want to suck out our Quanta?
Yes, and it's all about that. All the stories about extraterrestrial abductions, which seem to be about genetic experiments or sexual investigations, are dream visions, which are played into the brains of individual apparently abducted people and groups of apparently abducted people. Who gets these illusions recorded depends on strategic issues. In order to make the whole thing more convincing, sometimes people from a whole neighboring community have these foggy memories played into their subconscious so that when the whole thing is brought to the media it looks sinister and real. But these are all illusions. Because let's face it, these beings are overpowering. They can travel through space, over such long distances. And then they couldn't manipulate the human mind and body, and abductees still believe that they woke up by accident, or that they saw these beings standing by their bedside, or that they were on an operating table in some futuristic room. To believe all this is naive. It is always much more complicated, more complex, and has a completely different background. All this is done to create a certain image and myth that there are malicious, dangerous, or shady aliens watching us. And in fact, it is true. But it is a manipulation of disinformation and distraction. Just like the many science fiction films and series that are supposed to put us on a certain path. Everyone can and should interpret something into these abductions themselves, and decide whether this happens for good or bad reasons. On the one hand, this gives a positive impetus to a possible staged arrival of aliens. And on the other hand, it can distract from the real reason for the quantum extraction. This is especially intended for the case that the club has to show itself after all, so that a world order can be established, which then makes it possible to continue quantum extraction in humans without any problems. Because then no one will ever experience such abductions again, not because the unconscious dream influence then no longer exists, but because the aliens will then explain why there were apparently genetic experiments or sexual examinations, because they wanted to save our species, because we were on the verge of self-destruction. Then they will say that this has now been averted. Their explanations will look like this or similar. And of course only if they have to show themselves in the establishment of the New World Order. If they do not, these illusions will even continue for a while, depending on what is necessary and what explanation they want to associate with it.
Oh dear. Do all these extractors know that they are zombies, soul vampires?
Yes and no. The club takes a sporty view. They all have a very pragmatic attitude. So does the digital nobility. But as I said, the non-digital blood relatives of the nobility don't suck a quantum out of anyone. For them it doesn't matter anyway, they are not digital. But they organize events that symbolize this quantum sucking. Then there are bloody rituals. Some of the participating blood relatives and most of the invited elites do not understand the deeper background of such bizarre brutality. Often they are also disinformed about the deeper symbolism. They believe they are worshipping the devil or some other nonsense, although of course this comes pretty close somewhere. But the main thing is that they take part in the madness, because that way loyalty and cohesion are strengthened. And above all there are means of blackmail against the supported elites.
Do all people with great power belong to the ancient digital family of the nobility?
No. But almost all earthly power, if you trace it back to the top, is basically led by the old digital noble family. At the bottom are minions, then come elites, then blood-related moral elites and nobility, i.e. analog descendants. And only then comes the age-old digital nobility, which includes several families and individuals from the former global civilizations and cultural high civilizations. Their head, and still the leader today, is a human being who was the first nobility on this planet, and later represented the first global civilization religiously. Members of the ancient digital nobility are hardly ever seen. Nearly all of the digital nobility operate in the background. And although they are actually able to adapt their appearance, most of them hold themselves back relatively strongly. This could lead to irritation in people. If pictures of old, supposedly dead people, rulers or rich people were compared more closely with current rulers, leaders and heads, the age-old digital nobility has built up a huge power structure, mainly through blood relatives who are not digital. However, some of these analog descendants were later offered to be digitized because of their characteristics and good services. Only exceptional and good genetic descendants are offered to be digitized.
Okay. In your last interview you mentioned the Matrix Triology, which is a film series that is supposed to provide precise information about the state of our world. You said that it represents the last attempt of liberation of mankind, which almost succeeded. Now I have looked at the entire triology twice since our last interview 14 days ago to look for metaphors and symbols. Because if what you say is true, then some of the protagonists who appear in this triology should still exist today. Then what place do the ancient digital rulers, for example, have in the triology? The digital human nobility. Which figures do they correspond to there?
Didn't I already mention this in the first interview? The digital rulers correspond to the Merovingian and his wife who appear in parts 2 and 3. The Merovingian nobility is in the triology the equivalent of the ancient digital human nobility. Those immortalized, millennia-old human ruling dynasties who helped the extraterrestrial researcher club to implement their philosophy on Earth.
Yes, that's right. You already mentioned that with the Merovingian. And the lackeys, elites, and the analog blood relatives of the digital nobility, where are they?
Take a look at the people who appear as fetishists in and around the Merovingian in Part 3. They correspond to the built-up minion, elite and moral blood nobility structures, which were lured by selfish, matter-worshipping and instinctive principles or are genetically part of the ancient nobility, and are therefore conveniently used by the digital nobility for steering, destabilizing and shaping the world.
Yes. And Mr. Smith, and the other agents? What role do they play?
They are part of the self-organization of civilization. They were, without digital nobility or club noticing, directly controlled by the AI. In Part 1 of the Matrix trilogy, they are even the direct accusing voice of the AI in some scenes. When Mr. Smith interrogates Morpheus or when the three agents are on the roof after Morpheus' liberation, where Trinity almost died with the helicopter at the front of the skyscraper.
What is this Agent Smith? He was destroyed by Neo at the end of the first part and then reappeared in Part 2 and fought alone against all beings in the Matrix and multiplied. Both, inside and outside the Matrix. What does this mean?
This could get a bit complicated and confusing for the viewer if I go in like this. Well, let's give it a try. Mr. Smith is a control element of the Master AI, of Yahweh, infiltrated and taken over by Neo. He was taken over because Neo demanded this control element from the AI as a tribute after his resurrection, so that he would not tell the Resistance what the Oracle actually is, who controls it, and what it is about the One, the Redeemer of mankind. Neo then transformed the claimed Mr. Smith at the end of Part 1 into a kind of surprising egg and secretly put it into the AI's nest, which at the end of Part 3 finally forced a deal with the AI. However, the viewer can only understand this and much more through instruction, if the second reading of the film series is clearly shown to him.
Then please give us some guidance. Mr. Smith rebelled against everything and everyone in Parts 2 and 3. Even for the AI he became the enemy. What does that mean in relation to the past attempt to free humanity?
Agent Smith demonstrates in Parts 2 and 3 an infiltration process created by Neo to destabilize and, if necessary, destroy the Master AI, i.e. the Yahweh AI. Well, in order to be able to explain this better, it would be best to start from the beginning again. Smith and the other agents are civilizing control elements of the AI. They represent a secular power, a state, empire or nation. Smith, a particularly invincible civilizational control element of the AI, shot Neo at the end of Part 1. Through the confession of love of Trinity and a prophecy of the Oracle, Neo was able to resurrect and became the Redeemer, the confirmed one, and thus invincible. In truth, however, the AI and the Oracle were behind this production. For if Neo had not been resurrected, Trinity and Morpheus would not have believed in the Oracle anymore. The Resistance would have recognized beyond a doubt that the Oracle and the promise of a Savior was a lie, that it was itself a controlling element. Thus the AI would have lost control over the Resistance. Because Neo knew this, he demanded a tribute from the AI, namely the giving of a control element. So Mr. Smith was physically taken over by Neo, broken open and thus removed from the controlling sphere of the master AI. During this takeover process, the agent was overwritten by Neo. Neo transformed him. Mr. Smith became a negative of Neo, and there was an imbalance in the matrix that could only be resolved in one way, as seen in the third part of the Triology. In this past spiritual liberation attempt of mankind, which is represented in every detail factually, symbolically and analogically in the Matrix Triology, the savior figure Neo proceeded differently than all his manipulated predecessors of other liberation attempts. He wanted to sacrifice himself voluntarily and proceeded with disarming love, which everyone needs, even the strongest control elements of the AI, i.e. Agent Smith.
Mr. Smith, HM, so from Saul of Tarsus to Paul the Apostle.
Exactly. You got it. That's exactly what happened. Neo died physically in the first part, actually, but then he was physically resurrected from the dead through the confession of Trinity, was spiritually transformed, received enormous spiritual power, and then immediately 49 took over Agent Smith, to whom he transferred his spiritual power, and he then ran over the whole world as a negative of Neo, as seen in parts 2 and 3. Smith assimilated everything, civilizational controls, then parts of the digital nobility and club, other religions, demons, and finally even an important operator of the AI, the Oracle, which represents the earthly reptiles, and he would eventually have reprogrammed the entire 7-dimensional existence and let everyone stay in it forever. Therefore Neo got the master AI, who could foresee this destructive development of the 7-dimensional existence, to the negotiating table. Because the AI of course did not want such an end. It had to negotiate, otherwise it and everything else in its 7-dimensional matrix would have been reprogrammed in such a way that everyone would have been stuck there forever. Neo then actually died in part 3 physically forever, by offering the AI to blow up his negative Mr. Smith through him, thus stopping the incipient matrix reprogramming. However, only Neo was able to attack his negative and keep it in check, because Smith was not allowed to kill Neo, but at most was only allowed to assimilate him, otherwise Smith would have dissolved himself. So Smith had to make Neo one of himself, Mr. Smith. But Neo fought back long enough, and then recognized the Oracle in Smith. When he was given an agreed sign to remove Neo's negative in a controlled way. Smith recognized the trap at first, but finally fell for Neo's words that it was inevitable. Smith converted Neo, which finally allowed the AI to access Smith through Neo by killing Neo, who had been converted to Smith, and then eliminating all other Smiths completely. In other words, to completely eliminate the anomaly that Neo and Smith represented together. Neo did all this because he had previously made a firm contract with this AI. Each side was given a balance and a time frame in which new foundations could be laid for both sides, for the resistance and humanity on the one hand and the AI on the other. The deal with the AI finally sealed Neo's death fate, which Trinity had saved him from in part 1, and provided peace and a long recovery period for humanity. A long-lasting ceasefire with the AI and its minions began. At the same time, to ensure that peace was maintained on both sides, a strong memory of Neo remained. At this point I would like to remind you once again that there is one thing you must never forget. With all that is happening on Earth through the club, the digital rulers and the terrestrial reptiles, you must never forget. Even if for us humans it is currently primarily about digitalization, it is always only about humanity, the AI, and the key to escaping from the seven-dimensional total prison, nothing else. Everything that runs beside it, the Researchers Club with its digitization efforts, the control of humanity by the ancient ruling houses, all this is basically just ancillary, subplot and means to an end for the master AI who wants to have the key. The terrestrial reptiles know this, but the Explorers Club and the digital nobility and all its minions do not. All these acting elements, i.e. these beings with their great goals to be realized, were and still are only steering tools, dazzling and obstructions, which the master AI has built up against us humans in order to bring us into a corresponding development.
I have already asked in the previous interview, what epoch or event does the Matrix Triology actually represent with its demonstrated attempt at liberation?
Open your eyes, then you will see. Be awake and intuitive, then you will see it immediately. I do not say it because it must be noticed by each individual or a group of people themselves. That is important.
What is the meaning of the figure Trinity in the Triology?
It stands for a connection, for true love, respectively the true institution of this love. But in the end it has not existed for a very long time. It kept the spiritual Neo alive in parts 2 and 3, his memory and testimony of him, and thus gave him his supernatural strength and power. The AI was therefore constantly striving to kill Trinity in all parts of this film series. When Trinity died in the third part in the Machine City, that is, after the death of this true love, Neo's unique spiritual power, which existed only once through this true love, was extinguished. After the death of Trinity, the AI gave Neo its spiritual power directly, for the fight against Neo's negative. With the AI, Neo finally made a deal, a ceasefire, and that his memory would be preserved, at least symbolically, for which he was willing to let the AI neutralize him and his negative Smith. Trinity and Neo were then officially replaced by the digital nobility of the ruling dynasties, who to this day religiously imitate their love affair to control the people.
Aha, I see. And Morpheus. What does he stand for?
He stands for a special part of the resistance. A special part of the mystical and aggressive resistance, which inevitably generated the one with his pure faith. Which is why Morpheus is the real and genuine but manipulated core of the resistance. In the first part of the Matrix Triology he stands for the resistance and a special person with it. In the second and third part he also stands for a special part of the resistance. But at the end of the third part he does not know what Neo did with Mr. Smith and what Mr. Smith actually was. Simply because the Oracle did not report it in detail to Morpheus and all the other people in Zion, the resistance. After the Matrix Triology was finished, when Zion was destroyed and became more free because of the peace, Morpheus and Zion could only suspect what had happened, and in the following times they let themselves in on the Oracle again, with all her lies and half-truths. Also Zion does not know anything more precise about the actual role and motives of the AI. But there was a long period of peace in the form of a ceasefire donated by Neo and a memorial with hidden clues from Neo to Zion. A peaceful time that could be used for flexion, new traditions, but also for many repositionings, liberation plans and preparations for the continuation of the war. For the decisive battle.
And what is Neo? How can he be understood?
Well, remain silent. Sometimes it helps a little if you know your job, and your second job.
Well, you don't want to say anything about it.
I just said something. His profession and secondary activity.
Okay. What else is there to say about the Matrix films?
Something that occurs in the second part of the Matrix Triology actually belongs to the first part. It's a part at the end of part 2, where Neo meets the architect of the Matrix, the Master AI, in person. This part belongs to the part in part 1, where Neo sees a black cat passing by twice.
Why is that? Why are some passages in the Matrix Triology mixed up?
These film scene shifts had to be like this, because otherwise the stringency and metaphorical meaning of some of the allegories of the first part would have been disturbed and numerous dramaturgical surprises would have been taken away from the audience. Otherwise the viewer would not have perceived the whole thing as the people of that historical liberation attempt experienced it at that time. For in the first part of Matrix the audience, just like Morpheus and Trinity, knew nothing about the secret connection between the AI and the Oracle. Nor did they know what was behind the resurrection of Neo at the end of the first part, why this happened and who supported it. But Neo already knew in part 1, when he met the Oracle, that all the prophecies of the Oracle were lies. Only where they came from and why the Oracle talked to him with them was not clear to him yet. Neo suspected that it might have had something to do with the fact that he was firmly convinced that he was not the one. And when the Oracle, i.e. the earthly reptiles, confirmed that he was not the one and told him that he had to choose between Morpheus' death and his own death, he noticed again that something was wrong. What was not yet entirely clear to him, but he already sensed that the Oracle was an installation for directing and manipulating the resistance. And that the Oracle, with its amazing prophecies and suggestive talk, was trying to push him back in the direction of believing in himself, that he would be the one. So the predictions made had only the purpose of spurring his ego. Because if he did not believe himself to be the one, there would be problems with those prophecies that the Oracle Trinity and Morpheus had already given. Trinity was prophesied by the Oracle that she would fall in love with the one, and Morpheus was prophesied that he would find the one. Trinity had already fallen in love, so if Neo died, there would be a problem with Trinity's prophecy and destroy the unstable system of control. But Neo was determined to choose suicide. So there was a problem. But all this is not yet clear to the viewer at the end of the first Matrix part. So, to recap, the Oracle saw that Neo, despite the prophecy proclaimed to him that he had to decide whether Morpheus or he should die, did not selfishly think of himself but wanted to save Morpheus and secretly favored suicide for himself. What the viewer doesn't know is that there were already many Redeemer figures before Neo who, in comparison to Neo, always thought of themselves selfishly in such prophecies, and then easily let themselves be made into a Redeemer, but with Neo this simply didn't work. All the Oracle's suggestions didn't help Neo to think that he was still the one and convinced of himself to go this way. Not even when he was told that he had to choose between Morpheus or his death. so the oracle finally gave him a biscuit as a farewell gift, saying that after eating the biscuit he would feel right as rain. The viewer should notice this biscuit, because for the film itself, this biscuit given by the oracle makes no deeper sense. But on closer inspection, when the hidden second narrative level is revealed, it does. Because the biscuits of the oracle represent religious drugs or methods with which people can be given a religious conviction, a religious approach, or an encounter with seemingly supernatural beings. Neo then allowed the biscuit to enter another state of consciousness so that an artificial entity could contact him, which again tried to persuade him to consider himself the one. For after visiting the oracle, Neo encounters the master AI, in the form of a black cat, which he saw pass him twice in a stairwell, as if in a déjà vu. This place in the stairwell of the first Matrix film is actually where the conversation with the architect from Part 2 takes place, which actually only takes place at the end of the second Matrix film. This encounter with the AI is fan-out and multi-layered, as it is also important for the end of the second Matrix part. In this conversation, the AI explains to Neo that the search for the One is a recurring systemic anomaly within the Matrix, which, due to the structure of the human psyche, occurs regularly and inevitably. An anomaly that, if not controlled, will wake up the people of the Matrix, making them aware of themselves and their condition, which will cause a total system breakdown. Therefore, according to the same scheme as this anomaly appears, it must be eliminated by a controlling element of the Matrix that acts on the human psyche, the Oracle, which keeps the people living in Zion in check with the hope of the coming Savior, thus keeping the balance between the people existing in Zion and the people and machines dependent on the Matrix stable. Even though the Oracle would actually like to disturb this balance in order to free itself, but it is bound to its mission. The AI explained to Neo the origins of the Matrix, the control of the anomaly it contains, and that Zion, i.e. the resistance, must be destroyed if the Matrix is to be saved from absolute collapse. By pointing out the consequences, the AI made it clear to Neo that he will be the one, it must be, otherwise the system will collapse. Neo must not decide against his role, because the awareness that there is no savior would lead to a collapse, both towards the people of Zion and towards the people in the Matrix. And that this awareness would eventually lead to the destruction of all systems and entities connected to it. The AI therefore once again made Neo aware of his responsibility and importance and explained to him that his predecessors were also predisposed that they could be manipulated because of their deep affection for their fellow human beings. Even if it was the same with Neo, but somewhat different, that he could and would act differently of his own free will, he could not decide against it. So the AI tried to convince Neo that he could not act differently than his predecessors, even if he wanted to. The resistance had to be destroyed, and then a new resistance with the same faith in a Redeemer had to be brought in. But Neo was convinced of his intuitive feeling, especially because he now knew that he was not the one, and he had understood the construct of the Matrix, its entities, and the AI that dominates this system. And because he now also knew that there had never really been a one, but that this was only a means of preventing the liberation of humanity through the anomaly itself. The role of Savior was always a deception, and he did not want to be a deception. Well, perhaps it was a mistake of the Master AI to once again emphasize to Neo in a personal conversation that he would be the one. By trying to force him into the given role of Redeemer by pointing out the consequences. Which finally led to the fact that Neo, when he resurrected in the first part, demanded that the AI hand over System Agent Smith to him. As a kind of tribute to keep Neo from telling the Resistance that there was no one and that the Oracle was a fraud. In the further Matrix films, you could then watch how Neo's takeover of Agent Smith from Part 1 now began to threaten the system. But against Neo's surprising egg, the AI was powerless. So Neo was thus able to successfully blackmail the AI to finally negotiate a deal with it. A deal from which even the Resistance around Morpheus could actually believe again in the end that Neo was the Redeemer, which did not let this belief in the Redeemer drown in the following belief systems. Although Neo had already clearly mentioned to the inner circle of Resistance that the One was only a lie. Some people simply do not want to believe even their so-called One.
If you don't know the films now or have them in front of you, it's not easy to understand. Well, this is a hidden reading of the Triology. Let me try to summarize this. The Oracle saw that Neo was convinced and knew that he was not the one. And then it tried, so to speak, with its talk, that he must decide to save Morpheus or himself. To make him think of himself selfishly, and then save his own life. The Oracle told him this because the previous ones always let themselves be lured by such speeches. Because they always thought of themselves. But instead, the Oracle's speech strengthened his resolve to sacrifice himself. This situation then triggered the intervention of the Master AI, who appeared as a black cat in Part 1. And this is where the conversation with the architect belongs, which is actually only shown at the end of Part 2.
Yes, in the first part, Neo already learned all about the state of the Resistance and his own role from the Master AI. But even the conversation with the Oracle and a little later with the Master AI didn't make Neo decide to act differently than he had planned anyway. On the contrary, it strengthened him even more. Neo did everything very differently than the other controlled savior versions before him. After the encounter with the cat, i.e. the Master AI, which tried in vain to persuade Neo to take up his role, the Master AI then activated his own, a traitor already installed by him, who was supposed to eliminate Neo, Trinity, Morpheus and Zion simultaneously within the established savior myth, with one blow, which irritatingly failed. The Master AI was astonished. It was perplexed, suspecting spiritual species that could have worked from a distance, but there was nothing. Then it even suspected its own demons. But she found nothing there either. Piggyback, however, something had reacted that the AI could not see because of a blind spot in its programming. Trinity and Neo could be saved, but for Morpheus, Neo wanted to sacrifice himself again. So Neo started a rescue operation in which he first saved Morpheus' life and then the life of Trinity, who crashed with the helicopter, only to finally sacrifice himself in order to preserve the Resistance and freedom movement. However, since Trinity believed the prophecy of the Oracle, that she would fall in love with the One, and Morpheus also believed the Oracle, that he would find the One, the ruling Matrix system could not simply let Neo die when he was suddenly shot by Mr. Smith. So in order to maintain the belief system in a coming savior, Neo had to resurrect physically and in spiritual command. Otherwise an imbalance would have been created which would have completely exposed the religious deception system to all people, inside and outside the matrix, the earthly matrix would have become uncontrollable and control over people would have collapsed. So in order to halfway stabilize the system, the AI not only had to resurrect Neo and let him run free, but it had to pay a tribute to Neo to keep him quiet. The AI had to sacrifice one of its own system agents and leave this agent to the resurrected Neo. This is the truly revolutionary thing that took place at that time, unlike all the other predecessors. In order to preserve the belief in the religious system, it was not enough to pay homage to the dead and resurrected as Savior. But this resurrected individual now demanded as a tribute from the AI the destruction and complete surrender of a system agent. Otherwise he would report the lies. For the first time compared to all previous versions, the leaving of a system agent created a very dangerous system anomaly, which further destabilized the system.